The wind does not simply blow atop the summit of Mount Washington. It weights the world. It is a physical presence, a heavy, invisible hand that presses against the stone walls of the observatory, seeking out every microscopic fissure in the mortar. Inside the small, dim room, the air is a composition of deep blues and charcoal grays, a scene rendered in the soft, thick strokes of a waxen pastel. The shadows are not black, but a profound, bruising indigo, layered over a surface that feels as rough as the granite outside. A single lantern sits upon a heavy oak desk, its flame a small, flickering heartbeat of amber and ochre. The light does not travel far. It clings to the edges of the brass instruments, catching the curved glass of the barometer and the cold, silver spine of the mercury thermometer. The observer sits in a chair that has been smoothed by decades of silent waiting. He is wrapped in layers of heavy, unprocessed wool, the fibers scratching against his skin with a rhythmic, dull persistence. Every movement is slow, hampered by the weight of the fabric and the crushing density of the cold that has managed to seep through the 3-foot-thick stone walls. The cold here is not a temporary state. It is an ancient inhabitant of the peak, a silent companion that settles in the lungs and slows the pulse. It is a heavy cold, a cold that tastes of iron and old snow. Outside, the world has ceased to exist in 3 dimensions. There is only the white, swirling chaos of the rime ice, and the sound. The sound is a low-frequency moan, a subterranean vibration that rattles the heavy iron chains bolted deep into the mountainside to keep the building from being scoured into the valley below. The observer listens to the chains. He listens to the way they strain, a metallic groan that echoes the groaning of the timber joists. His task is the observation of the invisible. He must document the unseen forces that batter the summit, recording the numbers that represent the fury of the atmosphere. The ink in his well is thick, almost sluggish, resisting the nib of his pen. He waits. He waits for the precise moment to step out into the void. The wind outside is clocking at 90 miles per hour, a steady, relentless push that makes the very air feel like a liquid, thick and resistant. He thinks of the mercury. He thinks of the way the silver liquid retreats into its bulb, shrinking away from the bitterness of the night. It is a slow retreat, a quiet surrender to the falling temperature. The temperature is a number, but to the observer, it is a physical weight upon his shoulders. It is the stiffness in his fingers and the way his breath crystallizes into a fine, white powder before it even leaves his lips. The room is filled with the scent of whale oil and damp wool. It is a heavy, grounding smell, the smell of endurance. In the corner, a small coal stove glows with a faint, resentful heat, its iron belly clicking as it expands and contracts. The heat does not reach the corners of the room. In the corners, the frost has begun to grow, blooming in delicate, fern-like patterns across the rough-hewn stone. These patterns are beautiful in a cold, indifferent way, white traceries against the dark gray of the rock, like graphite drawings on a blackened sheet. The observer watches the frost. He watches it creep toward the desk, a slow, crystalline invasion. He does not move to scrape it away. To do so would be a waste of motion, an unnecessary expenditure of heat. In this place, every movement is calculated. Every breath is measured. The silence of the room, punctuated only by the roar of the gale outside, is a thick, velvet blanket. It is a silence that has its own weight, a silence that speaks of the vast, unpeopled spaces of the White Mountains, where the snow lies in drifts 40 feet deep, and the trees are stunted, twisted things, bent double by the prevailing winds. The history of this place is a history of silence and measurement. Since the first permanent weather station was established in the winter of 1870, men have sat in this very spot, staring at the same brass dials, recording the same relentless data. They were men of duty, men who understood that the atmosphere is a book that must be read one cold, painful syllable at a time. The observer thinks of those who came before him. He thinks of their handwritten ledgers, filled with the neat, slanted script of the 19th century, documenting the great intercollegiate expedition, the first time men dared to inhabit the summit through the long, dark teeth of winter. They sat in the same indigo shadows, lit by the same amber flames, listening to the same iron chains screaming against the granite. Their suffering was a quiet thing, a private negotiation with the frost. There were no heroics, only the steady, monotonous recording of the wind speed, the humidity, and the barometric pressure. It was a duty born of a desire to understand the engine of the world, to map the currents of the air that bring the storms and the calms. He reaches out a gloved hand and touches the brass casing of the anemometer register. The metal is so cold it feels as though it might burn through the leather and wool. The register clicks. Each click is a fraction of a mile of wind passing over the roof. Click, click, click. It is the heartbeat of the mountain. It is a slow, rhythmic sound that marks the passage of the night. The observer begins to prepare himself for the trek to the outdoor instruments. This is the ritual of the hour. He pulls on a heavy parka made of thick, oil-treated canvas, lined with the fur of a creature that knew how to live in the snow. The parka is stiff, standing almost on its own, a heavy shell that encases his torso. He pulls the hood up, the fur trim tickling his cheeks, and ties the leather thongs tight under his chin. He checks his goggles, the glass dark and thick, designed to protect his eyes from the scouring needles of the rime ice. Every step of the process is deliberate. There is no haste. Haste is the mother of error, and on the summit, error is a cold, final thing. He stands by the heavy, reinforced door. The door is thick, made of multiple layers of oak and iron designed to withstand the pressure of a hurricane. He can feel the vibration of the wind through the wood. It is a living thing, the wind, a beast that is constantly pacing outside the walls, looking for a way in. He places his hand on the iron latch. The latch is frosted over, a white coating of ice that shatters as he grips it. He takes a deep breath, feeling the cold air settle in the bottom of his lungs like a pool of lead. The transition from the dim, amber light of the room to the screaming white darkness of the summit is a violent shift, yet he moves into it with a practiced, heavy grace. He leans his weight against the door, pushing back against the atmosphere. The wind resists him. It pushes back with a force that feels personal, a solid wall of air that refuses to be moved. Slowly the door gives way, opening a sliver of an inch, then two. A flurry of fine, sharp snow ice swirls into the room, dancing in the lantern light like microscopic diamonds before vanishing into the shadows. The sound of the wind changes from a low moan to a high, piercing shriek as the seal is broken. The observer steps out into the vestibule, a small, unheated transition space. He closes the inner door behind him, bolting it shut. Now he is in the intermediate zone, a place where the warmth of the lantern is a memory and the cold of the mountain is a reality. He waits here for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the absence of light. The vestibule is a space of deep, velvet blacks and the faintest, ghostly grays where the moonlight struggles to penetrate the frosted windows. He can hear his own breathing, a ragged, rhythmic sound inside the confines of his hood. His breath is the only warmth left in the world. He reaches for the outer door, the final barrier between himself and the peak of the northeast. The outer door is even heavier. It is crusted with several inches of rime ice, a white, feathery growth that looks like frozen breath. He has to use his shoulder to break the seal of the ice. With a sharp, cracking sound like a rifle shot, the ice gives way. He steps out. Immediately, the wind catches him. It is a physical blow, a strike to the chest that steals the air from his lungs. He is no longer an observer. He is a speck of carbon clinging to a rock in the sky. The world is a blur of blue-gray shadows and white, horizontal streaks of snow. The ground beneath his heavy boots is uneven, a treacherous landscape of frozen boulders and slick, black ice. He moves by touch as much as by sight, his hands finding the guide ropes that have been strung between the buildings. The ropes are thick with ice, tripled in diameter by the frozen moisture of the clouds. They feel like cold, iron pipes in his hands. He makes his way toward the instrument shelter, a small wooden crate on stilts, painted white but now obscured by the rime. The shelter is designed to allow the air to flow through while protecting the thermometers from the direct strike of the snow. He reaches the shelter and pauses. He must wait for his heart rate to slow, for the adrenaline of the exit to subside, so that his movements can remain precise. The wind screams past his ears, a sound so loud it becomes a form of silence. He can feel the mountain vibrating beneath his feet, the ancient granite shivering under the assault. He looks out, or tries to, into the abyss. There are no lights from the valley. The clouds have swallowed the world. There is only the dark, the cold, and the duty. He reaches for the door of the instrument shelter, his fingers numbing despite the heavy layers. The mercury is waiting. The history of the weather is waiting to be written in another line of neat, shivering script. He is the witness to the cold. He is the keeper of the silence. The wind continues its heavy, monotonous push, a force that has no beginning and no end, a loop of atmospheric energy that defines the very existence of the summit. The latch of the instrument shelter is a stubborn, frozen knot of iron, buried beneath a thick crust of rime. To the touch, the rime ice is not like the soft, crystalline flakes of a valley snowfall. It is a dense, architectural growth, a collection of white needles that have built themselves out of the very breath of the clouds. In the darkness of the summit, illuminated only by the faint, diffused glow of a small handheld lantern, the ice appears as a series of heavy, chalky strokes against the deep indigo of the night. It looks like a drawing made with a white pastel on a sheet of rough, charcoal-colored paper. The observer reaches out, his fingers encased in thick, stiff leather, and begins the slow process of clearing the latch. He does not use a tool. A tool might spark or slip. Instead, he uses the heel of his hand, striking the ice with a rhythmic, dull thud. Each blow is a heavy, muted sound that is immediately swallowed by the vast, roaring hunger of the wind. The ice shatters in small, brittle chunks, falling into the dark void at his feet like fragments of broken porcelain. His movements are glacial. In this degree of cold, the body rebels against the notion of speed. The blood retreats from the extremities, huddling around the core in a desperate, silent bid for survival. The observer can feel the stiffness in his elbows and knees, a mechanical resistance that mimics the freezing of the mountain itself. Finally, the iron latch is cleared. It groans as he turns it, a high-pitched, metallic protest that vibrates through his glove and into the bones of his arm. The door of the shelter swings open, and for a moment the wind catches it, trying to rip the wood from its hinges. He braces his shoulder against the frame, holding the door steady. Inside, the instruments sit in their designated places, small, silent sentinels of the atmosphere. The thermometers are long, slender tubes of glass, their wooden backings weathered to a soft silver gray. The light of his lantern catches the mercury. It is a thin, silver thread resting deep within the glass. He leans in close, his goggles fogging slightly from the heat of his skin. He must hold his breath. The warmth of a single exhale would be enough to skew the reading, to introduce a flicker of inaccuracy into the cold, hard data of the night. The number is 34 degrees below zero. It is a static, unchanging fact. The observer stares at the mercury until the image is burned into his mind, a sharp, silver line against the dark wood. He then checks the maximum and minimum thermometers, noting the slight deviations that occurred during the previous hour. Every number is a weight. Every decimal point is a piece of the mountain story. He reaches for the sling psychrometer, a specialized instrument consisting of 2 thermometers, one dry and one wrapped in a thin, wet muslin wick. This is the most taxing part of the hourly ritual. To measure the humidity, he must whirl the psychrometer through the freezing air, using the evaporation to cool the wet bulb. He steps back from the shelter, finding a small patch of level ground. He begins the motion. His arm moves in a slow, steady circle, the instrument whirring through the air with a low, rhythmic hum, round and round. The motion is hypnotic, a repetitive loop that occupies his entire consciousness. He counts the rotations. 1, 2, 3. The wind tries to catch the psychrometer, to knock it out of its steady arc, but the observer holds firm. He is a part of the machine now, a biological component of the weather station. His shoulder aches with a dull, heavy throb, the cold seeping through the seams of his parka. The world around him is a swirling tapestry of grays and blues, the rime ice on the rocks nearby glowing with a ghostly, bioluminescent quality in the dim light. It is a landscape of shadows, a place where the line between the earth and the sky has been erased by the clouds. He continues to whirl the thermometers, his eyes fixed on a single dark point in the snow. The repetition is a form of meditation, a way to distance himself from the biting reality of the frost. The cold is no longer a sensation. It is a state of being. It is the texture of his thoughts. It is the silence that underlies the roar of the gale. After several minutes, he stops the motion and quickly brings the thermometers to his eyes. The wet bulb has dropped significantly. He records the 2 temperatures in his mind, locking them away alongside the barometric pressure and the wind speed. He closes the shelter door, the latch clicking home with a finality that feels like the end of a long journey. The task is half finished. He must now make the return trip to the safety of the stone walls. The wind has shifted slightly, now coming directly from the northwest, a direction that brings the full, unmitigated force of the Arctic air down upon the summit. It is a heavy, crushing wind, a wind that feels as though it could flatten the very rocks. He reaches for the guide rope. It is thicker now than it was 10 minutes ago, the rime ice having grown even in that short span of time. The rope is a cold, unyielding tether, the only thing connecting him to the world of the living. He begins the walk back, leaning his entire body weight into the wind. Each step is a struggle, a slow-motion battle against the invisible wall of the atmosphere. His boots crunch against the frozen surface, a sound that is felt in the soles of his feet more than heard in his ears. The lantern in his hand flickers, the oil thickening in the cold. The light it casts is a pale, sickly amber, barely enough to illuminate the next 3 feet of the path. The shadows dance and stretch across the rime-covered boulders, creating monstrous, shifting shapes that seem to watch him as he passes. These are the ghosts of the mountain, the silent witnesses to his labor. He does not look at them. He keeps his eyes on the rope, on the frozen fibers that guide him through the void. His breath is a constant white plume, a rhythmic cloud that obscures his vision for a fraction of a second with every exhale. The world is a loop of cold, a continuous stream of blue-gray tones and sharp, icy textures. There is no beginning to the path and no end, only the steady, monotonous process of moving one foot in front of the other. The weight of his clothing seems to increase with every step, the wool and canvas having absorbed the moisture of the clouds and frozen into a rigid, heavy shell. Finally, the dark, solid mass of the observatory looms out of the swirling white. It is a shadow among shadows, a darker blue against the gray of the storm. He reaches the outer door and repeats the process of breaking the ice seal. The cracking sound is a welcome relief, a sign that the threshold is near. He slips inside the vestibule, the heavy door thudding shut behind him, cutting off the shriek of the wind. The silence here is sudden and profound. It is a thick, heavy silence that rings in his ears. He stands for a moment in the dark, letting his body adjust to the lack of motion. The air in the vestibule is still freezing, but the absence of the wind makes it feel almost warm. He can hear the blood pounding in his temples, a slow, heavy rhythm that matches the clicking of the anemometer register on the roof above. He moves to the inner door, his fingers trembling slightly as he fumbles with the latch. As he steps back into the main room, the amber light of the lantern on the desk greets him like an old friend. The room is exactly as he left it, the deep indigo shadows, the soft, flickering flame, the frost blooming in the corners like graphite ferns. He moves toward the desk, his movements still slow and deliberate. He sheds the heavy, frozen parka, the stiff fabric crinkling and groaning as he pulls it over his head. He lays it across a wooden bench where it retains the shape of his torso, a hollow, frozen monument to the walk he just completed. He sits in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The heat from the coal stove is a faint, distant thing, a promise of warmth that has yet to be fulfilled. He reaches for the inkwell. As he suspected, the ink has begun to skin over with a thin layer of ice. He picks up a small metal rod and gently breaks the surface, stirring the dark liquid until it is smooth once more. He opens the ledger. The pages are thick and creamy, the edges slightly curled from the dampness. He picks up his pen, the nib cold in his hand. He begins to write. The date, the hour, the temperature, the humidity, the wind direction, the sky condition. His handwriting is a neat, slanted script, a series of precise black marks against the white paper. Each letter is formed with care, a testament to the discipline of the observer. The numbers are a language, a way of translating the chaos of the mountain into something orderly and permanent. As he writes, he can feel the cold receding from his skin, replaced by a dull, aching soreness. It is the feeling of life returning to his limbs, a slow, painful awakening. The wind continues to batter the walls, a relentless, heavy sound that provides the soundtrack to his work. Click, click, click. The register continues its count. The mountain continues its breath. He leans back in the chair, his eyes fixed on the flickering flame of the lantern. The room is a sanctuary of shadow and light, a small, fragile bubble of human presence in a vast, indifferent wilderness. The history of this place is written in these ledgers, in the thousands of hours of silent observation, in the millions of numbers recorded by men who sat in this same chair. It is a history of endurance, of duty, and of the quiet, persistent search for understanding. The observer thinks of the hours ahead. There will be another reading in 60 minutes, and another 60 minutes after that. The night is long and the winter is longer, but the numbers must be recorded. The mountain must be watched. He watches the frost on the stone wall, noting how it has grown by a fraction of an inch since he left. It is a slow, beautiful growth, a white pastel drawing that is being created by the cold, one crystalline stroke at a time. The silence of the room settles over him like a heavy blanket, a deep, indigo peace that is as cold and as constant as the granite beneath his feet. The transition from the violent, horizontal world of the summit to the enclosed, vertical stillness of the observatory room is a slow process of decompression. It is not an immediate relief, but a shifting of burdens. The weight of the wind is replaced by the weight of the silence. The observer remains seated at the heavy oak desk, his body a collection of dull, rhythmic aches that pulse in time with the ticking of the long case clock in the corner. This clock, a sturdy piece of New England craftsmanship, has a pendulum that swings with a heavy, deliberate thud, a sound that feels like a heartbeat within the stone walls. The sound is thick and resonant, cutting through the indigo shadows like a dull blade. In the dim light of the oil lamp, the room continues to resemble a dark, hand-drawn sketch, where the edges of reality are softened by the application of charcoal and wax. The grain of the wood on the desk is highlighted by the amber glow, showing every scratch and every stain of ink that has accumulated over the seasons. It is a texture that invites the eye to linger, a rough, honest surface that has supported the weight of countless ledgers and the weary elbows of men who have long since descended the mountain for the last time. The ink on the page is now dry, the numbers fixed in their columns like tiny, frozen monuments to a moment that has already passed. The observer stares at the figure for the barometric pressure. It is a low number, indicating the deep, heavy trough of the storm that is currently anchored over the peak. He turns his attention to the mercurial barometer, a long, slender instrument encased in a frame of polished mahogany and brass. This is a Fortin barometer, a device of exquisite precision and absolute silence. He stands, his joints creaking like the old floorboards, and approaches the instrument. The light of the lantern follows him, a swaying circle of warmth that barely manages to push back the deep blues of the perimeter. He must adjust the cistern of the barometer, turning a small ivory screw until the surface of the mercury just touches the tip of an ivory point. This is the 0 point, the fundamental baseline for the measurement. The mercury is a pool of silver liquid, heavy and ancient, reflecting the lantern light in a way that makes it look like a drop of molten moonlight trapped in a glass tube. He moves with a practiced, heavy caution. To touch the glass would be to introduce the heat of his body, a variable that would expand the mercury and distort the truth of the air. He uses a small magnifying glass to read the vernier scale, his eye pressed close to the cold metal. The numbers are tiny, etched into the brass with a delicate, unwavering hand. He notes the reading, 23.42 inches. It is a falling pressure, a slow, downward slide into the heart of the cyclone. He records this in a secondary notebook, his handwriting remaining steady despite the chill that continues to radiate from his core. This process of measurement is the core of his existence. It is a boring, repetitive, and utterly essential task. The history of the weather is not a history of grand events, but a history of these small, quiet moments, the turning of a screw, the reading of a scale, the scratching of a pen. It is a history of endurance against the urge to stop, against the temptation to let the silence win. The shadows in the room seem to thicken as the night progresses. They are not empty spaces, but layers of deep, bruised color, ultramarine, Payne's gray, and a touch of violet. They feel as though they could be smudged with a fingertip, like the soft pastel dust of a drawing. The observer feels as though he is a part of this drawing, a figure rendered in heavy, dark strokes, his edges blurred into the background of the stone walls. The stove in the corner continues its low, metallic clicking, a sound that is both comforting and lonely. It consumes the anthracite coal with a slow, begrudging hunger, the heat it produces being a dry, dusty thing that smells of sulfur and old earth. He reaches for a small iron shovel and opens the stove door. The interior is a cavern of glowing embers, a landscape of fierce oranges and deep reds that provides a startling contrast to the blues of the room. He adds 2 small lumps of coal. The sound of the stones hitting the grate a sharp, clattering noise that briefly disrupts the hypnotic rhythm of the clock. He thinks of the coal. It was hauled up the mountain on the backs of pack horses in the late autumn, a long, shivering line of animals and men struggling against the first dustings of snow. Each lump of coal represents a specific amount of human effort, a calculation of survival. In this place, nothing is free. Everything has been brought up from the world below at a great cost of energy and will. The observer is the consumer of this energy, the one who turns the heat of the coal into the data of the weather. He is the bridge between the physical world of the mountain and the abstract world of the ledger. He returns to his seat, the movement feeling as though he is sinking back into a heavy, familiar mold. His thoughts are slow and circular, like the clouds that are currently scouring the summit. He thinks of the observers of the past, the men like Huntington and Hitchcock, who spent months in the original tip-top house, a low stone structure that was frequently buried entirely by the drifts. In those days, the instruments were even more primitive, the conditions even more brutal. They lived in a world of constant damp and eternal twilight, their only connection to the valley being a thin telegraph wire that would often snap under the weight of the ice. The observer can almost see them in the corners of the room, their ghosts rendered in the same soft, charcoal tones as the shadows. They are not frightening figures. They are companions in the long, boring labor of the watch. They represent a lineage of silent suffering, a tradition of men who chose to stand in the path of the wind and record its passage. The observer feels the weight of this tradition, a heavy mantle of wool and duty that keeps him anchored to the chair. He picks up a small piece of chamois cloth and begins to polish the brass bezel of the barograph, a mechanical instrument that records the pressure on a rotating drum of paper. The barograph is the most animated thing in the room. Its small, delicate arm moves up and down with agonizing slowness, the nib tracing a jagged, purple line across the grid. It is the mountain's own handwriting, a continuous record of the atmosphere's heavy, uneven breathing. The ticking of the clock, the clicking of the stove, and the scratching of the barograph pen create a symphony of the mundane. It is a soundscape that is designed to lull the mind into a state of semi-consciousness, a hypnotic loop that mirrors the circular nature of the work. The wind outside provides the bass note, a constant, low-frequency vibration that the observer feels in his teeth and his ribs. It is a sound that has no beginning and no end, a roar that has been going on for eons and will continue long after the observatory has crumbled back into the granite. He looks at his hands. They are the hands of a laborer, the skin chapped and red, the knuckles swollen from the cold. They are textured like the rough surface of the drawing paper, showing the lines of age and the marks of the mountain. He rubs them together, the sound of the dry skin a soft, rasping noise. There is no moisture here, only the cold, dry air of the heights. He thinks of the water he will have to melt for his morning tea, a slow process of turning a block of ice into a lukewarm liquid. Every task is a ceremony of patience. Every minute is a lesson in the passage of time. The lantern light begins to flicker slightly, indicating that the oil is running low. He does not move to refill it yet. He watches the flame as it dances, a small, fragile point of gold in the vast, indigo sea of the room. The flame is the only thing in the world that is not cold or gray. It is a tiny, defiant sun, holding back the night 1 inch at a time. The observer leans his head back against the wood of the chair. The darkness behind his eyelids is no different from the darkness of the room. He is suspended in a state of perpetual waiting. The clock thuds. The wind moans. The register clicks. These sounds are the boundary markers of his world. They define the limits of the possible. He is the weather observer of Mount Washington, a man whose life has been reduced to a series of numbers and a collection of shadows. He is the keeper of the silence, the witness to the ice, the recorder of the invisible. The cold is not an enemy but a condition of his existence. It is the air he breathes and the thought he thinks. It is the heavy, indigo blanket that covers the world, a drawing made of stone and wind and the slow, monotonous passage of the hours. He waits for the clock to strike the next hour, for the signal to once again wrap himself in the frozen wool and step out into the screaming white void. The duty remains. The mountain remains. The numbers remain to be written. The texture of the room feels increasingly dense, as if the very air were becoming thick with the pastel dust of the shadows. He can see the faint, rhythmic movement of the frost on the walls, the way the lantern light catches the edges of the crystals, making them look like a forest of tiny silver spears. These spears are growing, millimeter by millimeter, reclaiming the room for the mountain. The observer does not mind. He is a part of the reclamation. He is becoming as still and as cold as the stone itself. His breath is a slow, white ghost that haunts the space between his face and the ledger. He watches it rise and dissipate, a small, transient cloud in a room full of permanent things. The silence is a physical presence now, a heavy velvet weight that presses against his ears. It is a silence that contains all the sounds of the mountain, the groaning of the ice, the screaming of the wind, the cracking of the granite, all muffled and compressed into a single, unvarying tone. This is the tone of the summit, the sound of the world when it is stripped of everything but the essential. He listens to the silence, and in the silence he finds the strength to continue. The next hour is approaching. The mercury is waiting. The history of the cold continues to unfold, one slow, heavy page at a time. The small alcove that serves as a kitchen is a study in monochromatic utility, a narrow space where the shadows are at their deepest and most profound. It is a space where the indigo tones of the observatory coalesce into a dense, velvety layer of charcoal gray that seems to absorb the very idea of warmth. Against the back wall, a series of heavy pine shelves hold the provisions for the long winter, a collection of tins and jars that have become part of the room's architecture. The light of the observer's lantern reaches into this space with a hesitant, golden finger, casting a long, flickering shadow behind a single tin cup that sits upon the counter. The cup is cold to the touch, its surface covered in a fine, matte patina of oxidation that catches the light in a dull, silvery sheen. It is a heavy object, and when the observer moves it, the sound of the tin against the frozen wood is a muted, hollow thud that is immediately swallowed by the ambient roar of the gale. This is a place of small, necessary rituals, where the act of preparing a simple meal is a slow-motion battle against the inertia of the cold. The observer turns his attention to the wooden bucket that sits beside the small coal stove. Inside the bucket lies a block of ice, harvested from a sheltered crevice beneath a granite ledge earlier in the week. The ice is a dense, translucent blue-gray, a frozen fragment of the mountain that looks like a polished gemstone in the dim light of the room. He picks up a small iron pick, the handle worn smooth by his gloved hands. He begins to chip away at the ice, the sound of the metal against the frozen surface a sharp, rhythmic tink-tink-tink that echoes the ticking of the long case clock. Each fragment of ice that falls into the tin pot is a tiny, crystalline spark, a flicker of white against the dark gray of the bucket. He does not rush this process. There is no reason to hurry. The ice will take time to melt, and the water will take time to boil. Time is the only thing he has in abundance, a heavy, slow-moving river that flows around the stone walls of the station. He places the pot upon the top of the coal stove. The iron is hot, but the heat is localized, a small island of warmth in a sea of freezing air. He watches as the first tendrils of steam begin to rise from the pot. The steam is a ghostly white presence, curling into the indigo shadows and dissipating almost instantly. It is the only sign of change in a room that feels frozen in time. The scent of the melting ice is clean and metallic, a smell that is inseparable from the mountain itself. As the water warms, the observer leans against the counter, his weight supported by the heavy, rough-hewn wood. He can feel the vibration of the wind through the floorboards, a low-frequency hum that travels up through his boots and into his bones. It is the sound of the mountain's breath, a constant, heavy pressure that never relents. He thinks of the water, of how it was once a cloud scudding across the peak, then a snowflake caught in a crevice, and now a liquid trapped in a tin pot. It is a cycle of transformation that mirrors his own existence on the summit. While the water heats, he moves back to the instrument wall to observe the anemometer register. This device is the mechanical heart of the observatory, a complex arrangement of brass gears and clicking solenoids that translates the movement of the air into a series of marks on a paper strip. Outside, on the highest point of the roof, the 4 hemispherical cups of the Robinson anemometer are spinning in the darkness. They are driven by the invisible weight of the atmosphere, a force that is being measured and quantified with every revolution. The rotation is transmitted through a long, vertical shaft of cold steel that passes through the roof and into the register box. The observer watches the small, white enamel dial. The numbers are etched in a fine, black script, slightly yellowed by the fumes of the oil lamps. The needle moves in small, jerky increments, a physical representation of the wind's inherent instability. Click, click, click. Every time the cups outside complete a predetermined number of rotations, a small metal pen inside the register drops, leaving a purple ink mark on a rotating drum of paper. This clack is the most frequent sound in the room, a relentless metronome that measures the intensity of the storm. During the rare moments of calm, the clacks are spaced far apart, a lonely sound in the stillness. But tonight, the wind is rising. The clacking is becoming a steady, frantic vibration, a mechanical chatter that speaks of a wind speed approaching 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. The observer listens to the sound with a practiced ear, his mind automatically calculating the distance the air has traveled. He notes the way the rhythm changes, the way a sudden gust causes a rapid-fire sequence of clicks, followed by a brief, heavy pause as the atmosphere catches its breath. The paper drum rotates once every 24 hours, driven by a clockwork motor that must be wound with a heavy brass key. It is a continuous record of the invisible, a purple line that tells the story of the wind's passage over the granite. He returns to the stove and removes the pot. The water is not quite boiling, but it is hot enough to steep a bag of black tea. He pours the water into the tin cup, the sound of the liquid hitting the metal a splashing, resonant noise. The tea is a dark, amber liquid that brings a small, fleeting sense of comfort to the room. He holds the cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep through his gloves. This is the closest he will come to a luxury on the summit, the simple heat of a cup of tea. He stands in the center of the room, a solitary figure rendered in heavy, dark strokes of pastel and pencil. The light of the lantern catches the steam rising from the cup, creating a soft, glowing halo around his head. The shadows on the walls seem to move in response to the flickering flame, long, indigo fingers that reach out from the corners to touch the edges of his world. The observer thinks of the history of the instruments he tends. The Robinson anemometer was a breakthrough in meteorological science, a way to move beyond mere estimation into the realm of precise measurement. Before its invention, men had to rely on the Beaufort scale, judging the wind by its effect on the trees or the sea. But on Mount Washington, there are no trees of any size, and the sea is a distant, invisible memory. Here, the wind must be measured by its own power. He thinks of Thomas Robinson, the Irish astronomer who first conceived of the four-cup design in the 1840s. It is a simple, elegant machine, a way of harnessing the chaos of the air and turning it into a number. This desire for precision is what keeps the observer in his chair. It is what drives him to step out into the storm every 60 minutes. The numbers are the only thing that remains once the wind has passed. They are the artifacts of the atmosphere, the data points that will be studied by men in warm offices far below. The texture of the room continues to feel increasingly dense, as if the very air were becoming thick with the dust of the charcoal shadows. He can see the faint, rhythmic movement of the frost on the stone walls, the way the light catches the edges of the rime crystals. They look like a forest of tiny, silver spears, each one a testament to the moisture that has managed to seep through the mortar. The frost is a slow, beautiful invasion, a white pastel drawing that is being created by the cold, one crystalline stroke at a time. The observer does not mind the frost. He has come to appreciate its intricate patterns, the way it blooms in the corners like frozen ferns. It is a reminder that the mountain is always present, even inside the walls of the station. He is not a master of the peak. He is a guest, a temporary inhabitant who has been allowed to stay as long as he follows the rules of the ice. He sits back down at the desk, the tea cooling slowly in his hands. He looks at the heavy wool of his trousers, the fabric rough and thick, designed to trap as much heat as possible. Over his trousers, he wears a pair of heavy canvas leggings, reinforced with leather at the knees and ankles. His boots are massive, made of oil-tanned leather and lined with sheepskin. They are heavy, clunky things that make every step a deliberate act of will. He feels the weight of his clothing as a constant pressure, a reminder of the environment he inhabits. To live on the summit is to live in a state of perpetual encasement. He is a man within a suit, within a room, within a building, within a mountain. Each layer is a defense against the cold, a barrier between his fragile biological self and the indifferent fury of the weather. The long case clock begins to chime. It is a deep, resonant sound, a series of heavy, metallic notes that vibrate through the air. 1, 2, 3, 4. It is 4 o'clock in the morning, the deepest part of the watch. The world outside is at its most hostile, the cold at its most piercing. The observer knows that in a few minutes he must begin the process of dressing for his next excursion. He must once again pull on the frozen parka, tie the leather thongs, and step out into the screaming white void. The thought does not fill him with dread. It is simply a part of the loop, a necessary step in the monotonous progression of the night. He takes a final sip of the tea, the liquid now lukewarm and tasting of tin. He places the cup on the desk, the sound a final, quiet punctuation mark in the silence. He looks at the ledger once more. The page is waiting for the next entry. The numbers are already forming in his mind, the result of the mechanical clicking and the silver retreat of the mercury. He is the witness to the hour. He is the weather observer of Mount Washington, and the mountain is calling for its next measurement. The wind howls in a higher key now, a piercing shriek that rattles the glass in the windows. It is a sound that demands an answer. The observer stands, his body moving with the slow, heavy grace of an ancient machine. He reaches for his parka, the stiff fabric groaning as he lifts it. The ritual begins again. The indigo shadows deepen, the amber light flickers, and the cold waits patiently at the door. The hour of 4 in the morning carries a specific gravity, a density that is not present in the earlier portions of the night. It is the deep, hollow center of the watch, where the line between the observer and the environment begins to blur, as if the charcoal of his silhouette were being smudged into the indigo of the walls by a heavy, unthinking hand. The room feels smaller now, the shadows pressing inward with a soft, insistent weight. The lantern light has retreated to the very edge of the desk, its pool of amber narrowed to a thin, flickering circle that barely illuminates the dry, white paper of the ledger. The observer stands from his chair, a movement that is slow and agonizing, each joint announcing its protest with a dull, internal ache. His body has become a vessel for the cold, a container for the mountain stillness. He moves toward the wooden bench where his parka lies, the stiff canvas having solidified into a rigid sculpture of his own form. He reaches for the garment, and the sound it makes is a dry, rasping groan, the noise of oil-treated fabric resisting the change in its shape. It is a heavy sound, a texture of sound that matches the rough, graphite grain of the walls. He lifts the parka, feeling the incredible weight of it. It is not merely clothing. It is a suit of armor designed for a battle that consists entirely of standing still. He slides his arms into the sleeves, the interior wool lining feeling like 1,000 tiny needles against his skin. The wool is coarse and unprocessed, retaining the natural lanolin of the sheep, giving it a scent that is earthy, damp, and ancient. As the parka settles over his shoulders, he feels the familiar compression of the weight, a grounding force that anchors him to the floorboards. The process of dressing is a slow, monotonous liturgy, a series of repetitive motions that have been performed thousands of times in the dim, blue light of the summit. He begins to tie the leather thongs that secure the front of the parka. His fingers, thickened by the cold and the layers of silk and wool liners, move with a clumsy, heavy deliberation. Each knot is a small, focused effort. He watches his hands as if they belong to someone else, the dark leather of his gloves appearing as deep, charcoal shapes against the indigo shadows of his lap. The thongs are stiff with frost, their surfaces coated in a fine, white powder that falls away in microscopic flakes as he works. He does not hurry. To hurry would be to invite a mistake, to leave a gap in his defenses where the wind could find purchase. He pulls the cord at his waist, cinching the heavy canvas tight. He pulls the cord at his hem. He pulls the cords at his wrists. He is sealing himself into a private, airless world, a portable sanctuary of his own body heat. Next come the goggles. They sit on the mantle of the stove, the glass having been warmed slightly to prevent immediate fogging. He picks them up, the metal frames feeling like ice even through his gloves. He fits them over his head, the thick rubber strap pulling tight against the wool of his cap. Suddenly, his vision is restricted to a narrow, darkened field, a tunnel of gray and amber. The world becomes a collection of soft-focused textures and deep, chiaroscuro shadows. The lantern light is refracted through the thick glass, creating long, distorted streaks of gold that dance across the room. He checks the seal around his eyes, ensuring that no part of his skin is exposed to the air. The mask he wears over his lower face is made of thick felt, with a small, perforated metal plate for breathing. As he settles it into place, his own breath becomes a loud, rhythmic rasp in his ears, a mechanical sound that drowns out the ticking of the clock. The history of this shelter, this stone and iron box at the top of the world, is a history of such preparations. The observer thinks of the builders who hauled these very stones up the mountain slopes in the 1880s. They were men who understood the permanence of granite and the impermanence of human flesh. Each stone in the wall was chosen for its weight and its ability to lock into its neighbor, creating a monolithic defense against the atmosphere. They used a mortar mixed with local sand and iron filings, a concoction that has hardened over the decades into something stronger than the rock itself. The observer runs a gloved hand over the wall. The texture is incredibly rough, a landscape of peaks and valleys in miniature, rendered in the dark, moody tones of a charcoal sketch. He can feel the cold radiating from the stone, a deep, subatomic vibration that speaks of the mountain's vast, unmoving heart. He moves to the corner of the room to retrieve his ice axe. It is a long-handled tool with a heavy steel head, polished to a dull silver by years of contact with the rime. The axe is not for climbing, it is for survival. It is the tool he uses to clear the doorway, to chip away the ice that threatens to seal him inside or lock him out. He grips the wooden shaft, the grain of the ash wood feeling solid and dependable. He is now fully encased, a creature of layers and leather, ready to face the void. He stands by the door, his breath creating a rhythmic cloud of moisture that escapes through the vents of his mask. He looks back at the room one last time. In the dim, amber light, the desk, the ledger, and the flickering lantern look like a memory of warmth, a fading drawing on the edge of an abyss. The shadows are at their most beautiful now, deep, layered washes of blue and gray that seem to vibrate with the sound of the wind. He steps into the vestibule. The transition is marked by a drop in temperature that he feels even through the canvas and wool. The air here is dead and still, a pocket of frozen time between the inner and outer doors. He stands in the darkness, letting his eyes adjust to the absence of the lamp. The only light comes from a small, frosted window, a ghostly gray rectangle that reveals the swirling chaos of the storm outside. He can see the rime ice growing on the glass, beautiful, fern-like structures that seem to be reaching toward him. The sound of the wind is louder here, a high-pitched, metallic screaming that vibrates through the iron latch of the outer door. It is a sound of immense, unthinking power, a force that has no interest in the man standing in the dark. He reaches for the latch. This is the moment of greatest resistance, both physical and mental. To open the door is to invite the mountain in, to allow the screaming white darkness to fill the space. He braces his boots against the floorboards, his legs feeling heavy and stiff like columns of lead. He grips the handle with both hands and heaves. The ice seal cracks with a sound like a falling tree, a sharp, structural snap that echoes in the small space. The door swings open, and the pressure of the wind is immediate. It is a solid wall of air, a physical mass that slams into his chest and knocks the breath from his lungs. He leans forward, his weight balanced against the atmosphere, and steps out onto the summit. The world outside is a masterpiece of horizontal motion. There is no ground, no sky, only the relentless, scouring flow of the rime ice. The light is a dim, bruised indigo, the color of a deep shadow on a snowy field. He can see nothing beyond the first few feet of his own reach. The guide rope is a thick, white cable of ice, frozen into a rigid arc between the iron stanchions. He grabs the rope, his gloves sliding over the slick surface until he finds a grip. The wind tries to tear him from the rock, a constant, heavy shove that forces him to walk at a steep angle. Every step is a calculation. He moves his left foot, feeling for the uneven surface of the granite beneath the drifts. He waits. He moves his right foot. The sound is a roar that has no boundaries, a noise so loud it becomes a silence in the mind. He makes his way toward the precipitation gauge, a tall copper cylinder mounted on a heavy iron frame. The gauge is designed to catch the snow and ice, but in a wind this strong, the measurement is an exercise in approximation. He must clear the top of the cylinder, removing the built-up rime that would otherwise block the opening. He uses the head of his ice axe, the metal striking the copper with a muffled, ringing sound. The ice falls away in heavy, white sheets, vanishing instantly into the dark. He works with a slow, mechanical precision, his movements dictated by the rhythm of his breathing. The cold is a constant, pressing weight, a numbness that has begun to seep into his cheeks despite the mask. He feels the ice forming on his goggles, a thin, translucent film that further obscures his vision. He wipes it away with a rhythmic swipe of his sleeve, a motion that is as repetitive as the clicking of the anemometer. The mountain beneath him feels alive, a shivering mass of ancient stone that is being scoured and shaped by the wind. He thinks of the geological history of the peak, of the glaciers that once ground this granite into its rounded shape, and of the millions of winters that have followed. He is a brief, flickering moment in the mountain's timeline, a tiny spark of consciousness recording a fraction of its fury. The history of the weather is a history of these fractions, these small, painful measurements taken in the heart of the storm. He looks at the copper cylinder, now clear of ice, and notes the level of the frozen catch. It is a small amount, a few inches of wind-packed snow that represents hours of atmospheric struggle. He turns back toward the observatory, the wind now at his back, pushing him toward the dark, solid shape of the building. The return trip is easier in motion, but harder in spirit. The wind urges him forward, a heavy, impatient hand on his shoulders, but the cold has begun to settle into his bones with a permanent, aching weight. He follows the rope, his hands moving over the ice with a rhythmic, sliding motion. The world is a loop of blue-gray shadows and white streaks, a continuous stream of environmental endurance. There is no beginning to the path and no end, only the steady, monotonous process of moving from one point of safety to another. He reaches the outer door and fumbles for the latch, his fingers now almost entirely devoid of sensation. He pulls the door shut, the thud of the iron against the frame sounding like a final, heavy chord in a long, slow symphony. He stands in the vestibule, his body shivering with a violent, rhythmic intensity. This is the afterchill, the moment when the body realizes the depth of the cold it has just inhabited. He does not move. He waits in the dark, his breath a loud, ragged sound in the stillness. He listens to the wind screaming on the other side of the door, a sound that now feels distant and disconnected. He has done his duty for the hour. He has witnessed the storm. He has recorded the measurement. He moves to the inner door and steps back into the room. The amber light of the lantern is still there, a small, flickering point of gold in the indigo sea. The shadows are still there, soft and heavy on the stone walls. The ledger is still there, waiting for the next line of script. He begins the slow, heavy process of undressing, the frozen canvas of his parka groaning as he pulls it over his head. The ritual is complete, and the silence of the room settles over him once more, a thick, velvet blanket of cold and duty. The sound of the parka hitting the wooden bench is a dull, heavy thud, a sound that lacks any resonance or vibration. It is the sound of frozen mass meeting frozen wood. As the ice begins to transition from a solid state to a liquid one, the room is filled with a new, subtle auditory layer, the slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of meltwater hitting the floorboards. Each drop is a small, cold percussion, a tiny measurement of the room's meager warmth. The observer watches a single droplet as it forms on the hem of the canvas, swelling slowly until its own weight overcomes the surface tension, falling into the dark, indigo shadows below. This process is as slow as the movement of a glacier, a liquid clock that marks the recovery from the storm. The air around the bench becomes thick and humid, a localized fog of damp wool and evaporating rime that smells of ancient, wet earth and salt. It is a heavy, suffocating scent that settles in the back of the throat, a reminder of the physical cost of the observation. He sits back at the heavy oak desk, his movements still hampered by the lingering stiffness in his limbs. The lantern flame has stabilized, a small, unwavering cone of amber light that carves a sanctuary out of the deep, blue-gray gloom. He reaches for a small, wooden box kept in the center drawer. Inside, nestled in velvet that has long since lost its nap, lies the maintenance kit for the triple register. This instrument, the crown jewel of the observatory's mechanical suite, requires a level of care that borders on the religious. It is a complex assembly of brass, steel, and glass, a machine that simultaneously records wind speed, wind direction, and the duration of sunshine. Though the sunshine recorder remains a silent, dark orb during these long winter nights, the observer picks up a small vial of clock oil and a fine camel hair brush. The brush is soft and delicate, a stark contrast to the rough, callous texture of his own skin. He begins the process of cleaning the nibs. There are 6 of them in total, small, tapered points of gold-plated steel that trace the purple ink lines across the rotating drum. He moves with a rhythmic, hypnotic slowness, dipping the brush into a cleaning solvent and gently stroking the metal. He watches as the dried ink dissolves, a dark violet cloud spreading through the clear liquid like smoke in a still room. This task is the epitome of the boring, necessary labor that defines his existence. It is a task that produces no immediate result, yet without it, the history of the mountain would become a blurred, illegible smudge. He thinks of the ink itself, a special formula designed not to freeze until the temperature drops well below 40 degrees. It is a thick, viscous fluid that clings to the nibs, a purple blood that gives life to the mechanical record. The triple register box is a landscape of tiny, clicking parts. He opens the brass housing, revealing the intricate gear train that drives the paper drum. The gears are polished to a high sheen, reflecting the lantern light in a series of fleeting, golden sparks. He applies a single, microscopic drop of oil to each pivot point. The oil is clear and heavy, clinging to the steel with a persistent grip. He listens to the change in the machine's voice. The clicking becomes softer, more melodic, a rhythmic clack-purr that blends with the ticking of the long case clock. This is the heartbeat of the station, a mechanical consciousness that never sleeps, never tires, and never complains about the cold. The observer finds a strange comfort in the machine's indifference. It does not feel the wind, it only measures it. It does not fear the ice, it only records its effects. To be like the machine, to be a silent, unfeeling witness, is the observer's ultimate, unattainable goal. As he works, his mind drifts to the construction of the building itself. The observatory is not merely a house, it is a bunker, a vessel designed to sail through the most turbulent atmospheres on the planet. He thinks of the heavy iron bolts, 3 feet long and an inch thick, that are driven deep into the Precambrian granite of the summit. These bolts are the only things preventing the building from being lifted bodily by a hurricane-force gust and deposited in the Great Gulf wilderness thousands of feet below. The walls are a sandwich of stone, air, and wood, 3 feet of granite on the outside, a 4-inch air gap to provide insulation, and then a thick inner lining of tongue-end groove spruce. The spruce is stained a deep, dark brown, a color that has absorbed a century of tobacco smoke, coal dust, and lantern soot. In the dim light, the wood grain looks like the surface of a dark, frozen lake, full of hidden depths and swirling charcoal patterns. The textures of the room are a composition in contrast. There is the hard, cold utility of the brass instruments, the soft, yielding dampness of the drying wool, the rough, abrasive surface of the stone walls, and the smooth, creamy expanse of the ledger pages. The observer feels these textures as much as he sees them. His world has been reduced to a sensory loop, a repetitive experience of the materials that surround him. He picks up a small piece of emery cloth and begins to polish the contact points of the sunshine recorder's electrical circuit. The sound is a low, raspy hiss, a rhythmic shhhshhhshhh that competes with the shriek of the wind outside. He focuses on the small, silver buttons of the contacts, watching as the oxidation is rubbed away to reveal the bright, conductive metal beneath. It is a small victory over the elements, a momentary reversal of the mountain's slow, corrosive influence. He thinks of the history of the Great White Hills, as the early settlers called them. Long before the observatory was built, these peaks were considered the realm of the Great Spirit, a place where no man should tread. To the Abenaki people, the summit was Agiachuk, the place of the Great Spirit's home. They understood the mountain not as a collection of resources or a subject for measurement, but as a living, breathing entity of immense and terrifying power. The observer, in his modern, scientific arrogance, attempts to bind this power with brass gears and ink lines. But on nights like this, he feels the weight of the old beliefs. The mountain is not a passive object. It is an active participant in his suffering. It pushes against the walls. It seeks out the cracks in his armor. It numbs his mind with its monotonous roar. He is not studying the weather. He is negotiating with a deity that speaks in the language of barometric pressure and wind chill. The long case clock strikes the half hour. The sound is a single, heavy thrum that vibrates through the floorboards. The observer pauses in his cleaning, his hands resting on the brass housing of the register. He looks at the shadows on the wall, noting how they have shifted as the lantern oil burns down. They are long, thin shadows now, reaching out like the fingers of a skeletal hand. They seem to point toward the door, a silent reminder of the next excursion. The frost on the stone wall has reached the edge of the spruce lining, a white, crystalline fringe that looks like the lace on a Victorian morning dress. It is a beautiful, cold decoration, a sign of the mountain's creeping victory. He knows that if he were to stop the stove, if he were to stop the movement of his own body, the frost would cover everything in a matter of hours. The room would become a white, silent tomb, a charcoal drawing obscured by a layer of white pastel. He returns to the ledger, the central document of his life. He turns back several pages, looking at the entries from a week ago, a month ago, a year ago. The handwriting changes. Sometimes it is his own. Sometimes it belongs to the other observers who share the rotation. But the story remains the same. It is a story of numbers. It is a story of 34 degrees, of 92 miles per hour, of heavy rime and blowing snow. There are no personal notes in the margins, no descriptions of feelings or fears. The ledger is a record of the atmosphere, not the man. To include oneself in the record would be a violation of the observer's code. He is a ghost in his own history, a nameless hand that moves the pen. He thinks of the thousands of pages that have been filled since 1870, a vast library of the mundane, a monument to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of absolute boredom. His tea has long since gone cold, a dark, stagnant pool in the bottom of the tin cup. He does not drink it. He watches the way the light reflects off the surface of the liquid, a distorted golden ring that wobbles as the building shudders under a particularly strong gust. The gust is followed by a long, low moan from the iron chains outside, a sound that feels as though it is being pulled from the very bowels of the earth. It is a sound of immense fatigue, the sound of the mountain itself growing tired of the wind. The observer feels a similar fatigue, a deep structural weariness that goes beyond the need for sleep. It is a tiredness of the soul, an exhaustion born of the constant, repetitive demand for attention. The mountain demands to be watched. The instruments demand to be tended. The numbers demand to be recorded. There is no end to the demand, only the slow, heavy progression of the hours. He begins to wind the clockwork motor of the barograph. The key is heavy and cold, the internal spring offering a stiff, clicking resistance. He turns it slowly, feeling the tension build within the machine. This tension is what drives the record, what keeps the purple line moving across the grid. He feels a kinship with the spring. He, too, is wound tight by the pressure of the environment, a coiled energy that is slowly being released through the act of observation. He checks the ink levels in the reservoir, adding a single drop of the violet fluid with a steady hand. The nib is currently tracing a slow, upward curve, a sign that the very center of the storm has passed and the pressure is beginning its long, agonizing climb back toward the normal. It is a small change, an invisible shift in the weight of the air, but to the observer, it is a significant event. It is a chapter break in the story of the night. The visual field of the room remains a masterpiece of the low key. The deep indigo of the walls, the charcoal gray of the shadows, the amber gold of the lamp, and the silver white of the frost create a palette that is both somber and deeply soothing. It is a world without sharp edges, a world where everything is softened by the application of time and cold. The observer closes his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the room wash over him. The drip, drip, drip of the melting ice. The clack-purr of the register, the thud-thud-thud of the pendulum, the shriek-moan of the wind. These are the four movements of his symphony, a composition that has no resolution, only a continuous, looping repetition. He is the conductor of this silence, the one who ensures that every note is played and every silence is observed. He opens his eyes and reaches for the pen. The hour is almost up. The mercury is waiting. The loop is ready to begin again. The long case clock in the corner of the room, a heavy mahogany sentinel with a pendulum of polished brass, continues its relentless, rhythmic thud. Each swing is a heavy, audible weight that drops into the silence of the room, a heartbeat that is felt in the floorboards and the marrow of the observer's bones. In the dim, indigo light, the clock face is a pale, ghostly orb, the Roman numerals etched in a fine, black script that seems to float upon the silvered surface. The hour hand has moved with agonizing slowness, a microscopic progression that mirrors the movement of the stars above the thick, obscuring clouds. The shadows in the room have reached their maximum density, a layered composition of charcoal and deep violet that makes the walls feel as though they are made of velvet rather than granite. The observer remains seated, his hands resting upon the rough surface of the oak desk. He is a study in stillness, a figure rendered in the soft, thick strokes of a dark pastel, his edges bleeding into the gloom of the perimeter. He reaches for the oil lamp, his movements so slow they are almost imperceptible. The glass chimney of the lamp is clouded with a fine gray film of soot, a carbonized history of the night's burning. This soot is a delicate, fragile texture, a collection of microscopic particles that have settled upon the glass like a layer of dark dust. He picks up a soft, lint-free cloth, a piece of an old cotton shirt that has been laundered 1,000 times until it is as thin as a moth's wing. He begins the ritual of cleaning the chimney. This is a task of absolute patience, a boring, repetitive motion that occupies the center of his consciousness. He removes the glass cylinder, the metal clips groaning with a faint, high-pitched protest. The air in the room, deprived of the lamp's immediate warmth, feels instantly colder, a sharp, metallic chill that settles upon his knuckles. He breathes upon the glass, the warmth of his lungs creating a brief, translucent fog that quickly vanishes into the indigo shadows. He uses the cloth to wipe the interior of the chimney, his finger moving in a slow, circular arc. The sound is a low, raspy squeak, a rhythmic shhh-shhk that provides a counterpoint to the ticking of the clock. He watches as the soot is transferred from the glass to the cloth, creating a dark, charcoal smudge against the pale fabric. This smudge is the physical manifestation of time passing, a measurement of the oil consumed and the light produced. He repeats the motion over and over until the glass is once again clear and transparent. He holds it up to the faint, diffused light of the glowing stove. The glass is now a perfect, fragile void, ready to contain the flame for another hour of the watch. As he replaces the chimney, the flame flares up, a small, bright point of amber gold that casts a new set of shadows across the stone walls. The light catches the frost on the mortar, making the rime crystals glitter like a field of frozen diamonds. The observer watches the light. He thinks of the history of the Signal Service, the military predecessor to the Weather Bureau, which first established this permanent post in the 1870s. Those early observers were soldiers of the atmosphere, men like Sergeant Abbott and Private Clough, who were ordered to inhabit the peak as if it were a besieged fortress. They lived in a world of constant, low-level suffering, their days a monotonous cycle of measurement and survival. Their only link to the civilization below was a thin, copper telegraph wire that stretched down the mountain's spine, a fragile thread of communication that would often sing in the wind like a haunted violin. The observer can almost hear that singing now, a high-frequency vibration that resonates through the building's heavy iron chains. The telegraph wire was a lifeline and a burden, a constant reminder of the world they had left behind. In those early years, the observers would sit in the indigo shadows, much like he does now, and tap out their reports in Morse code, a series of dots and dashes that translated the fury of the mountain into a language of electrical pulses. The click-clack of the telegraph key was the only voice the summit possessed, a rhythmic, mechanical stutter that carried the weight of the wind and the depth of the cold down to the valleys. He looks at the corner of the room where the old telegraph table once stood, the wood now scarred and empty, a ghost of a previous era. The history of this place is built upon these layers of silent labor, these decades of men sitting in the dark, recording the invisible. The texture of the room feels increasingly heavy, as if the very air were becoming saturated with the dust of the charcoal shadows. The observer feels the weight of the wool blanket draped over his shoulders, the fibers thick and coarse, retaining the scent of old wood smoke and the sharp, clean smell of the snow. The wool is a heavy, grounding presence, a protective shell that keeps the core of his being from dissolving into the cold. He reaches for a small wooden box on the desk, the lid carved with a simple geometric pattern. Inside is a collection of spare nibs for his pens, small, silver-tongued objects that wait in a bed of dark velvet. He chooses one and fits it into the holder, the click of the metal a sharp, final sound in the stillness. This nib will write the history of the next hour. It will record the slow rise of the barometer and the steady, relentless count of the anemometer. His thoughts turn to the coal stove, the iron belly of which has begun to cool as the anthracite is consumed. He stands and moves toward the coal scuttle, his boots making a heavy, muffled sound against the floorboards. The scuttle is made of thick, black iron, and inside lie the small, glinting lumps of coal, like dark gemstones retrieved from the earth's deep, cold heart. He picks up the small shovel, the handle cold and smooth in his hand. He opens the stove door, and the room is momentarily filled with the fierce, orange glow of the dying embers. This light is a stark contrast to the indigo and charcoal tones of the room, a violent eruption of color that makes the shadows dance in a frantic, shifting pattern. He adds 3 lumps of coal, the sound of the stones hitting the grate a sharp, clattering noise that echoes off the stone walls. The smell of the fresh coal is acrid and sulphurous, a dry, dusty scent that fills his nostrils and settles in the back of his throat. He watches as the new coal catches, small blue flames licking at the edges of the black stones. This is a slow process, a quiet transition from cold stone to radiant heat. He closes the stove door, and the room returns to its somber, monochromatic state. The heat from the stove is a faint, distant promise, a warmth that barely manages to push back the encroaching frost. He returns to his seat, the movement feeling as though he is sinking back into a heavy, familiar mold. His body has become a part of the room's architecture, a stationary object that is being slowly covered by the dust of the hours. The wind outside has shifted to a lower, more resonant frequency, a deep, guttural moan that vibrates through the foundations of the building. It is the sound of the mountain's heavy, uneven breathing. The observer listens to the sound, his mind automatically categorizing it. This is a wind of 85 miles per hour, a steady, unyielding pressure that is currently scouring the rime from the western faces of the boulders. He thinks of the rime ice, how it grows against the wind, a paradoxical movement that seems to defy the laws of nature. The moisture in the clouds freezes instantly upon contact with the rock, building outward in long, feathery needles that point toward the source of the storm. It is an architectural growth, a frozen landscape that is constantly being built and destroyed by the atmosphere. On the summit, nothing is permanent except the granite and the duty. He looks at the ledger once more, the creamy pages reflecting the amber light of the lamp. The entries are a long, continuous stream of data, a boring history of the atmosphere that stretches back for more than a century. There are days of absolute calm, recorded in a series of zeros and stagnant numbers, and there are days of absolute fury, where the pen struggled to remain steady against the vibration of the building. To the observer, all days are the same. They are all composed of the same 60-minute intervals, the same rituals of measurement, and the same heavy, indigo silence. The history of the weather is a history of endurance, a testament to the fact that someone was always there to watch, to record, and to wait. He is the current link in this long, cold chain, a witness to the silence of the night. The visual field of the room remains a masterpiece of the dark and the textured. The deep blue-gray of the walls, the charcoal shadows, the silver white of the frost, and the flickering gold of the lamp create a palette that is both somber and hypnotic. It is a world that invites the eye to linger on the small details, the grain of the wood, the texture of the wool, the curve of the glass. The observer feels a sense of profound, heavy peace in this environment. It is a world without distractions, a world where the only thing that matters is the next measurement. The silence is a physical presence now, a heavy, velvet weight that presses against his ears. It is a silence that contains all the sounds of the mountain, all the history of the cold, and all the quiet suffering of the men who came before him. He picks up a small, brass-handled brush and begins to clear the dust from the base of the barograph. The sound is a low, rhythmic hiss, 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 a sound that matches the breathing of the stove. He moves the brush with a slow, mechanical precision, ensuring that every microscopic particle is removed. This is a task that has no end, as the coal dust and the rime powder are constantly settling upon the instruments. It is a labor of Sisyphus, a repetitive process that provides a structure to the hours. He does not mind the repetition. It is the core of his existence, the loop that keeps him anchored to the summit. He looks at the clock. The next hour is approaching. The mercury in the thermometers is waiting to be read. The wind is waiting to be quantified. The loop is ready to begin again, a continuous, heavy stream of environmental history that is being written in the dark, one slow, methodical stroke at a time. The hour between 5 and 6 in the morning is the hour of the deep gray. It is a time when the indigo of the midnight watch begins to surrender, not to light, but to a slightly paler, more translucent shade of charcoal. The room feels as though it is being redrawn, the artist trading a soft, blunt wax crayon for a harder, sharper pencil of silver gray. The shadows do not disappear. They merely shift their weight, settling into the corners and beneath the heavy oak desk like a physical sediment. The observer remains in his chair, his body now a permanent fixture of the room's geometry. He feels the cold not as an external force, but as an internal architecture, a series of frozen beams and joists that hold his skeleton upright. The numbness in his feet has become a familiar, rhythmic vibration, a dull humming that matches the low-frequency drone of the wind. He looks at the wall, where the frost has continued its slow, crystalline march across the spruce panels. In the dim, amber light of the lantern, the rime looks like a topographical map of a distant, frozen planet, a world of ridges and valleys rendered in white lead and graphite. He turns his attention to the hair hygrometer, a delicate instrument housed in a small, ventilated brass cage near the barometer. This device, a masterpiece of 19th century ingenuity, relies upon a single, long strand of human hair to measure the moisture in the atmosphere. The hair, usually sourced from a woman of Northern European descent for its specific elasticity and lack of chemical treatment, expands and contracts with the humidity, moving a tiny, balanced needle across a silvered scale. The observer leans in close, his breath a slow, rhythmic plume that he must carefully direct away from the instrument. He watches the needle. It is a thin, black line, no thicker than the hair that drives it. It moves with a glacial slowness, a microscopic tremor that represents the mountain's shifting breath. The history of this device is a history of the fragile measuring the immense. It was Horace Benedict de Saussure, the Swiss physicist, who first perfected the use of hair in the 1780s, realizing that the most intimate parts of the human body were the most sensitive to the changes in the air. The observer finds a strange, hypnotic comfort in the hygrometer. It is a silent witness to the unseen weight of the clouds. He thinks of the woman whose hair now serves the summit, a person who is likely thousands of miles away, perhaps sleeping in a warm bed in a valley city, entirely unaware that a part of her is currently vibrating with the fury of a Mount Washington gale. This connection between the human and the atmospheric is the core of the observer's existence. He is a biological sensor, a machine of flesh and wool that translates the environment into the ledger. He picks up his pen, the nib cold and scratchy against the paper. He records the humidity, 98%. The air is saturated, a thick, invisible soup of ice crystals and water vapor that is currently being driven through the cracks in the stone walls. The ledger is now more than half full, its pages a heavy, cream-colored weight of accumulated hours. The visual field of the room is a study in the movement of light through dust. The lantern oil is low, and the flame has begun to sputter, casting long, rhythmic shadows that pulse against the stone. These shadows are not empty. They are filled with the fine, white powder of the rime ice that has managed to bypass the door seals. The powder dances in the air, a microscopic ballet of frozen water that catches the amber light and turns it into a shimmering, golden haze. It is a scene that would require the softest of pastels, a layering of white over deep blue, with a touch of ochre at the center. The observer watches the dust. He follows a single particle as it drifts across the desk, landing on the edge of the inkwell. It is a tiny, geometric perfection, a hexagonal star that exists for a few seconds before the meager heat of the room turns it into a microscopic bead of water. This is the life cycle of the mountain: ice to water, water to vapor, vapor to ice. It is a loop that never breaks. He thinks of the Winter of the Giant, the legendary season of 1884, when the observers were trapped inside for weeks at a time, the snow drifting up to the second-story windows of the old stone house. They lived in a world of absolute, crushing silence, the only sound the rhythmic thump-thump of the wind against the drifts. Their diet was a monotonous cycle of salt pork, hardtack, and weak coffee, their only entertainment the reading of the same 3 books by the light of a single tallow candle. They became like the stones they inhabited, cold, hard, and unmoving. One observer, a man named Sergeant John Murphy, wrote in his private diary that he had begun to forget the sound of his own voice, having had no reason to speak for 40 days. The silence of the mountain is a corrosive thing. It eats away at the edges of the mind, leaving behind only the essential, the numbers, and the duty. The current observer feels this silence now. It is a heavy, velvet pressure against his eardrums, a sound so profound it has a texture like rough wool. He stands to perform a small, necessary task: the winding of the sunshine recorder. This instrument, a glass sphere that acts as a burning lens, sits on a high pedestal on the roof, but its mechanical base is housed within the station. The sphere focuses the rays of the sun onto a strip of treated cardboard, burning a line into the paper whenever the clouds break. On a night like this, there is no sun, but the clockwork mechanism that rotates the cardboard strip must still be wound. The observer reaches for the heavy brass key, his fingers stiff and clumsy. The winding is a slow, rhythmic process: click, click, click. The sound is metallic and sharp, a series of small structural shocks that travel up his arm. He counts the turns, ensuring that the tension is exactly right. To overwind would be to break the spring, to underwind would be to lose the record. In this place, the balance is everything. The texture of the room continues to shift as the pre-dawn light begins to exert its influence. The deep blues are being replaced by a cold, steely gray, a color that has no warmth and no depth. It is the color of the granite outside, the color of the ice, the color of the observer's own thoughts. He looks at his hands, the skin translucent and pale, the veins appearing as delicate, indigo lines beneath the surface. He is becoming a part of the palette, a figure of gray and blue lost in a landscape of shadow. He thinks of the history of the tip-top house, the original summit hotel that served as the first winter observatory. It was a low, squat building of unmortared stone, held together by its own weight and the sheer stubbornness of its creators. The men who lived there were pioneers of the atmosphere, measuring the wind with simple wooden vanes and recording the temperature with mercury that frequently froze solid in the bulb. Their suffering was not a choice, but a condition of their curiosity. The wind outside has entered a new phase, a sustained, high-pitched whistle that sounds like a steam locomotive at full throttle. It is a sound of incredible velocity, a wind speed that is likely approaching 100 miles per hour. The building shudders, a deep, structural groan that makes the ink in the well ripple in a series of perfect, concentric circles. The observer watches the ink. It is a dark, violet mirror, reflecting the flickering flame of the lamp and the gray square of the window. He feels a sudden, heavy sense of isolation. He is 3,000 feet above the nearest human being, a lone consciousness perched on a rock in the sky. The world below, the villages, the forests, the frozen rivers, is a distant, irrelevant memory. There is only the room, the ledger, and the wind. This is the true nature of the watch. It is a stripping away of the superfluous until only the task remains. He returns to the stove and adds the final lumps of coal from the scuttle. The fire is a low, persistent glow, a small pocket of orange in a sea of gray. He watches the coal catch, the smoke curling upward into the chimney in a slow, hypnotic spiral. The scent of the sulfur is heavy and grounding, a reminder of the earth's deep heat. He knows that in an hour he will have to descend into the basement to retrieve more coal, a journey through a dark, unheated stone stairwell where the walls are coated in 6 inches of solid ice. That task is a weight in his mind, a future chore that anchors him to the present. He does not dread it, he simply acknowledges it as a part of the loop. Everything on the summit is a chore. Everything is a measurement. Everything is a repetition. The long case clock strikes the half hour with a single, resonant thrum. The sound is thick and heavy, a vibration that seems to hang in the air long after the metal has stopped moving. The observer looks at the clock, the brass pendulum swinging with a rhythmic, unvarying motion. It is a machine of absolute certainty, a device that does not care about the wind or the cold. He feels a brief, flickering moment of kinship with the clock. Like the pendulum, he is caught in a perpetual arc, moving between the desk and the door, between the ledger and the storm. His life is a series of 60-minute intervals, a continuous stream of observations that will eventually form a single, unbroken line in the history of the mountain. He picks up the chamois cloth and begins to polish the brass bezel of the clock, a small, unnecessary act of devotion. The surface of the brass is cold and smooth, reflecting a distorted amber version of his own face. He looks at his reflection, the dark circles under his eyes, the frost-nipped skin of his nose, the gray wool of his cap. He looks like a character from a 19th century tintype, a ghost of the past caught in the present. The history of Mount Washington is a history of these ghosts, these men who chose the silence of the summit over the noise of the valley. He is proud of his place in this lineage, but it is a quiet, heavy pride, a pride that is felt as a weight in the chest rather than a lift in the spirit. He finishes polishing the brass and returns to his seat. The ledger is waiting. The hour is almost up. The mercury is preparing for its next reading. The world outside remains a screaming white void, but inside the indigo shadows are slowly, reluctantly turning to gray. The loop continues, a boring, beautiful, and essential history of the cold, written one slow, methodical character at a time. The transition from the deep gray of the pre-dawn into the pale, sickly light of the false dawn is a process that occurs without the presence of the sun. It is merely a shifting of the opacity of the clouds, a thinning of the indigo veil that has draped the summit for the last 12 hours. The room in the observatory has reached a state of thermal equilibrium with the mountain, a point where the heat of the small coal stove is no longer a force of expansion, but a mere suggestion of survival. The observer stands from his desk, his body feeling like a collection of rusted clockwork gears, each movement accompanied by a slow internal grinding. He looks at the coal scuttle. It is empty, save for a fine black dust that has settled into the grain of the wood. The journey to the basement is now a necessity, a chore that sits upon his shoulders with the weight of a stone mantle. He picks up the heavy iron bucket, the handle a cold, biting arc against his palm, and moves toward the narrow door that leads to the lower levels. The staircase is a descent into a deeper, more profound darkness. It is a vertical tunnel carved into the very heart of the granite, where the walls are not lined with spruce, but are exposed, raw rock. The air here is dead. It does not move with the wind. It simply exists in a state of permanent, absolute frost. As he descends the first step, the light from his handheld lantern reveals a landscape of ice that has grown over the decades. The walls are coated in a thick, translucent layer of glaze, a frozen skin that captures the lantern light and refracts it into 1,000 tiny, distorted prisms. It looks like a drawing made with a silver pencil on a sheet of black slate, every line sharp and cold. The stairs themselves are treacherous, each tread covered in a fine, gritty layer of frost that has the texture of crushed glass. He moves with a rhythmic, heavy caution, his left hand gripping the ice-slicked railing, his right hand balancing the empty bucket. The sound of his boots on the stone is a flat, dead clack, a noise that does not echo because the ice absorbs the vibration. It is a sound of immense isolation. He is now below the level of the wind, yet he can feel the mountain vibrating around him. The foundation of the observatory is bolted into the Precambrian rock, and the energy of the storm on the summit is transmitted through the stone as a low-frequency hum, a subterranean growl that he feels in the arches of his feet. This is the sound of the mountain's structural integrity being tested. He thinks of the architectural history of the basement, which was reinforced in the early 20th century with heavy timber balks and iron stanchions. These supports were brought up the cog railway during the short summer months, a massive undertaking of engineering and sweat. Each beam was positioned to counteract the lateral pressure of the wind, creating an internal skeleton that mirrors the external armor of the stone. He reaches the bottom of the stairs. The coal cellar is a cavernous space, the shadows here so thick they feel like a physical liquid. The walls are black with coal dust, a fine carbonized powder that has permeated every crack and crevice. This dust is a texture that contrasts sharply with the white rime of the upper floors. It is soft, matte, and incredibly dense. In the dim, amber light, the piles of anthracite coal look like a range of miniature, jagged mountains, their surfaces glinting with a dull, metallic sheen. The observer sets the bucket down, the sound a hollow, ringing clang that feels out of place in the muffled silence of the cellar. He picks up the large iron shovel, the blade worn thin and sharp by years of scraping against the stone floor. He begins the work. The movement is a slow, repetitive loop. He drives the shovel into the base of the coal pile, the sound a rasping, crunchy scritch as the metal bites into the stones. He lifts the weight, his muscles tensing against the gravity, and swings the shovel over the bucket. The coal falls into the iron container with a series of sharp, clattering notes, a rhythmic tumble-thud that marks the progress of the task. He does not rush. To rush would be to stir up the dust, to fill his lungs with the fine black powder of the earth. He breathes through his felt mask, the air tasting of iron and ancient vegetation. The coal he shovels today was formed millions of years ago, a compressed history of solar energy that he is now retrieving to keep the cold at bay. It is a cycle of deep time, a connection between the prehistoric swamps and the frozen peak of the mountain. As the bucket fills, it becomes a massive, unyielding weight. The observer pauses for a moment, leaning on the handle of the shovel. His breath is a thick, white cloud that hangs in the still air of the cellar, a ghostly presence in the charcoal shadows. He thinks of the men who worked in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, the ones who extracted this fuel from the dark places of the world so that he could burn it in this high, cold place. Their labor is a part of his story, a silent contribution to the record he keeps in the ledger. The history of the weather is a history of energy, the energy of the sun, the energy of the wind, and the energy of the men who stand between the two. He feels a sense of heavy, monotonous solidarity with those distant laborers. They, too, knew the weight of the shovel and the texture of the dark. He picks up the full bucket. The iron handle groans under the strain, the metal digging into the leather of his glove. He begins the ascent. The stairs, which were a descent into darkness, are now a climb toward the pale, gray light of the upper floor. Every step is a concentrated effort of the will. He moves with a slow, mechanical gait, his body leaning forward to balance the weight of the coal. His breath is a loud, rhythmic rasp in his ears, a sound that matches the clack-clack of his boots. The ice-covered walls of the stairwell seem to watch him as he passes, the silver-gray reflections of his lantern dancing across the frozen surface. He feels the cold of the stone through the soles of his boots, a persistent, numbing chill that creeps up his legs. The world has been reduced to this staircase, this bucket, and the necessity of the next step. When he reaches the top, the transition back into the main room is marked by a slight increase in the ambient light. The false dawn has arrived, turning the windows into rectangles of opaque, steely gray. The room is still filled with indigo shadows, but they are thinner now, more transparent. He moves toward the stove and sets the bucket down, the sound a final, heavy thud. He is exhausted, but it is a familiar, comfortable exhaustion, a tiredness that has become a part of his identity. He opens the stove door and uses a small poker to stir the remaining embers. They are a deep, resentful red, a glowing coal heart that refuses to die. He adds the fresh anthracite, the stones clicking as they settle into the heat. Soon, the blue flames will begin to lick at the edges of the new coal, and the room will receive another hour of meager warmth. He returns to his desk, the movement feeling as though he is re-entering a long-abandoned habit. He picks up the pen. It is time for the 6 o'clock reading. This is the hour of the transition, the moment when the night watch technically ends and the morning watch begins, though for the observer there is no difference between the two. He looks at the barometer. The pressure is holding steady, a flat line on the barograph that suggests a period of atmospheric stasis. The wind, however, has not relented. It continues its high-pitched, metallic shriek, a sound that has become the background radiation of his mind. He notes the temperature on the indoor thermometer, 42 degrees. The stove is doing its work, but it is a losing battle against the granite. The visual field of the room is now a masterpiece of the monochromatic. The deep blues of the night have faded into a range of grays, charcoal, slate, ash, and silver. It is a world without color, a world rendered in the hard, precise lines of a graphite drawing. The frost on the walls is at its most beautiful in this light, the crystals appearing as a dense, white forest against the gray wood. The observer watches the frost. He notes how it has grown by several millimeters during his descent to the cellar. It is an unstoppable crystalline tide, a slow-motion invasion that he can only delay, never defeat. He feels a strange, cold affection for the frost. It is an honest enemy, a force that does not hide its intentions. He looks at the ledger. The page for the night is nearly full, a long column of numbers and symbols that document 12 hours of environmental struggle. Each entry is a testament to his presence, a record of the fact that he did not sleep, did not falter, and did not stop. The history of the weather is a history of this persistence. It is a boring, repetitive, and utterly essential document of the planet's breath. He thinks of the millions of people in the valley who will wake up and look at the sky, wondering what the day will bring. They will see the clouds and the snow, but they will not know the numbers. They will not know the pressure, the humidity, or the exact velocity of the wind. Only he knows. He is the keeper of the truth of the air, the silent witness to the invisible forces that shape the world. He picks up a small, woolen cloth and begins to wipe the dust from the surface of the desk. The motion is slow and circular, a rhythmic shhhshhshhh that matches the ticking of the clock. This is the final ritual of the hour, a cleaning of the workspace before the next cycle begins. He moves the cloth over the dark oak, watching as the fine black film of coal dust is removed to reveal the deep brown grain of the wood. It is a small, satisfying act of restoration. He is preparing the desk for the next man or for his own next hour, a continuous loop of maintenance and observation. The long case clock begins to chime the hour. 6 deep, resonant notes that vibrate through the indigo-gray air. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The watch continues. The mountain remains. The observer picks up his parka, the frozen canvas groaning as he prepares to step out into the screaming white void once more. The ritual of the hour is a weight, but it is also a comfort. It is a structure that prevents the mind from dissolving into the vast, indifferent silence of the summit. He is the weather observer of Mount Washington, and his work is never finished. The cold waits at the door, the wind waits on the roof, and the mercury waits in the glass. He steps toward the vestibule, a shadow among shadows, a figure of charcoal and gray lost in a world of ice. The loop is ready to begin again, a boring, beautiful, and essential history of the cold, written in the dark, one slow, methodical character at a time. The 7th hour arrives not as a dawn, but as a subtle, almost imperceptible thinning of the heavy, charcoal curtains that have draped the summit for the duration of the watch. It is a transition from the profound, bruising indigo of the deep night to a flat metallic silver that offers no warmth and no promise of a sun. The room in the observatory remains a sanctuary of shadow, a landscape rendered in the soft, thick strokes of a dark pencil on a rough surface. The observer sits at the heavy oak desk, his body feeling like a part of the chair's own joinery, a stationary object that has been weathered by the passage of the hours. He looks at the ledger, the creamy pages now filled with the data of the night. The ink is dry, a series of precise, violet-black marks that represent 12 hours of atmospheric endurance. Each number is an anchor, a weight that keeps the history of the mountain from drifting away into the screaming white void of the storm. He prepares for the final recording of the shift. This is the 7:00 a.m. entry, the formal conclusion of the night's labor. He picks up the pen, the metal holder cold and familiar in his hand. The nib is slightly worn, a microscopic flat spot on the tip that makes a soft, rhythmic scritch-scritch as it moves across the paper. He records the barometric pressure, 24.01 inches. The rise is steady, a slow, heavy climb that suggests the atmosphere is finally regaining its equilibrium. He records the temperature, 28 degrees below zero. The cold has not relented. It has simply become a permanent condition of the room. He records the wind speed, 82 miles per hour. The shriek outside has settled into a consistent, high-frequency drone, a sound that has the texture of a raspy, iron file being drawn across a stone edge. The visual field of the room is at its most delicate in this transition light. The shadows have lost their sharp edges, becoming soft, hazy washes of gray and blue that seem to float in the air like dust. The lantern light is a pale, sickly amber, its influence confined to the immediate circle of the desk. The frost on the stone walls has reached its maximum extent, a thick, white forest of rime that glows with a ghostly, internal light. The observer watches the frost. He follows the intricate, fern-like patterns of the crystals, noting how they mimic the organic shapes of a forest he has not seen in months. In this high, frozen place, the ice is the only thing that grows. It is a slow, silent agriculture, a harvest of frozen moisture that is reaped by the wind and sown by the clouds. He stands to perform the final winding of the long case clock. This is the most sacred of the observatory's rituals, the act that ensures the continuity of time itself on the summit. He opens the mahogany door, the hinges making a low, resonant groan that echoes in the stillness. Inside, the heavy brass weights are near the bottom of their travel, their surfaces dark and oxidized. He fits the winding key into the arbor and begins to turn. The sound is a rhythmic, metallic clack, 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 a series of structural shocks that vibrate through his arm and into his chest. He feels the tension building in the cable, a heavy, unyielding resistance that speaks of the clock's immense power. He winds the strike weight first, then the time weight, his movements slow and methodical. Each turn of the key is a commitment to the next 24 hours, a guarantee that the pendulum will continue its heavy, rhythmic thud. The history of this clock is a history of the station. It has stood in this corner since the building was first bolted to the granite, its heartbeat a constant presence through hurricanes and blizzards. It has witnessed the arrival and departure of dozens of observers, men who came up the mountain with hope and left with the heavy, indigo silence of the summit etched into their faces. The clock does not care about the men. It only cares about the gravity that pulls its weights toward the center of the earth. The observer feels a sense of profound, heavy humility in the presence of the machine. He is a temporary occupant, a flickering spark of life in a room full of permanent, cold objects. He closes the clock door, the click of the latch a final, heavy punctuation mark in the silence. He returns to the desk and begins the process of cleaning his instruments for the final time. He uses a piece of soft chamois to wipe the brass bezel of the barograph, his hand moving in a slow, circular motion. The sound is a low-frequency hiss, a rhythmic shhhshhhshhh that matches the breathing of the coal stove. He watches the violet line on the rotating drum, a jagged, beautiful record of the night's pressure changes. The line is a self-portrait of the storm, a graphic representation of the invisible forces that have been battering the walls. He checks the ink reservoir, adding a final drop of the thick, dark fluid. The nib continues its slow, downward crawl, a silent witness to the mountain's breath. His thoughts turn to the descent, the journey back to the world of the living that will eventually come. He thinks of the valley, of the trees that do not shiver, and of the air that does not shriek. He thinks of the smell of pine needles and damp earth, a scent that seems like a fantasy in this metallic, sulfurous room. But the descent is not for today. Today, he will remain in the loop. He will sleep for a few hours in the narrow, lightless bunk in the rear of the station, his dreams filled with the rhythmic click-clack of the anemometer and the heavy blue shadows of the stone walls. Then he will wake, and the cycle will begin again. The coal will be shoveled, the mercury will be read, and the wind will be quantified. There is no end to the duty, only the slow, heavy progression of the hours. The texture of the room feels increasingly dense, as if the very air were becoming a solid mass of charcoal and graphite. The observer looks at his hands, the skin rough and dry, the lines of his palms filled with the fine black dust of the coal. He is becoming a drawing, a figure of gray and blue lost in a world of ice. He picks up the small, brass-handled brush and clears a final layer of rime powder from the base of the thermometer stand. The sound is a soft, rasping noise, a texture of sound that is inseparable from the cold. He moves the brush with a practiced, heavy grace, his mind empty of everything but the task. This is the secret of survival on the summit, to become as boring and as repetitive as the weather itself, to lose the self in the measurement, to become the observer and nothing more. The false dawn has transitioned into a true gray morning. The windows are no longer black voids but translucent screens of silver-white light. The world outside is still invisible, a swirling chaos of clouds and rime, but the quality of the light has changed. It is a heavy, oppressive light, a light that reveals the true depth of the isolation. The observer looks out the window, his goggles resting on the desk. He sees the thick crust of ice on the glass, the frozen breath of the mountain that has been layered on, stroke by stroke, throughout the night. It is a masterpiece of environmental art, a drawing that will be erased by the first thaw and recreated by the next storm. He feels a sense of profound, heavy peace. The night is over, and the record is complete. He picks up the ledger and closes it. The sound of the heavy, linen-covered boards meeting is a solid, final thump. It is the sound of 12 hours of history being locked away. He places the ledger in the center of the desk, perfectly aligned with the edges of the wood. He places the pen beside it. He places the lantern in the corner, the flame now a tiny, flickering point of gold that is barely visible in the gray light. He stands and walks toward the rear of the room, his boots making a heavy, muffled sound against the floorboards. He stops at the small, iron stove and looks at the glow of the embers. They are a deep, dark red, the color of a dying star. He adds a final lump of coal, the sound of the stone hitting the grate a sharp, clattering noise that is immediately swallowed by the silence. He moves to the narrow bunk and sits on the edge of the mattress. The wool blankets are heavy and cold, the fibers thick and coarse. He does not undress. He simply lies back, the weight of his clothing a familiar, grounding pressure. He closes his eyes, and the darkness behind his eyelids is no different from the darkness of the room. He listens to the sounds of the observatory, the thud-thud-thud of the pendulum, the clack-purr of the register, the drip-drip-drip of the meltwater, the shriek-moan of the wind. These are the sounds of his world, the four movements of a symphony that has no end. He feels himself drifting into a state of semi-consciousness, a slow-motion descent into the indigo depths of sleep. The mountain continues its breath. The wind continues its scouring. The ice continues its growth. The history of the weather is being written in the silence of the room, a boring, beautiful, and essential record of the cold. The observer is no longer a man. He is a part of the mountain's architecture, a stationary object in a world of horizontal motion. He is the keeper of the silence, the witness to the ice, the recorder of the invisible. The loop is closed, and the loop is open. The next hour is approaching, and with it, the next measurement. But for now, there is only the heavy, velvet weight of the blankets and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the clock. The cold is a constant, the duty is a constant, and the silence is absolute.